Where is it? No. No, where is my watch? Ethan Whitmore suddenly froze. His watch was gone. He checked it again. That's not possible, he muttered. Ethan leaned forward and checked the floor mats. Nothing. Then the center console. Still nothing. The watch wasn't just an object. It had belonged to his father. Years earlier, on the night Ethan signed the first major deal that built Whitmore Capital, his father had taken the watch from his own wrist and placed it in Ethan's palm. Some things, the old man had said quietly, carry more than time. Ethan had never lost it. Until today, the passenger door opened and a burst of cold air rushed inside. "Dad, it's freezing out there." His daughter Lily climbed into the seat, pink ballet bag swinging against her coat. She buckled her seatbelt and looked at him curiously. "You look stressed." Ethan sighed. "I lost something." "What?" "My watch." Lily's eyes widened. "The one Grandpa gave you?" Ethan nodded. "Oh." Even at 7 years old, she understood that meant it mattered. "Where did you lose it?" Ethan closed his eyes for a second and replayed the afternoon, leaving the office, driving across town, stopping quickly for something to eat. The hot dog cart, the mustard spilling onto his hand, taking the watch off to wipe it clean. Then Lily calling him on the phone. "Dad, you're late." He had rushed back to the car. Too rushed. Ethan opened his eyes. The hot dog stand. Lily blinked. "What?" "I must have dropped it there." He started the SUV immediately and pulled out of the parking lot. 10 minutes later, Ethan turned onto Jefferson Avenue. The bus stop appeared first, then the laundromat with the flickering neon sign, then the spot where the hot dog cart had been. Except the cart was gone. Ethan slowed the SUV and pulled to the curb. The sidewalk was empty now. Only a faint square of melted ice marking where the cart had stood earlier. He stepped out quickly and scanned the ground. No watch. Damn. A bus driver leaning against the stop sign watched him searching. "You lose something?" the driver asked. "A watch," Ethan replied. "Fancy one?" "Yes." The man shrugged. "The hot dog lady packed up not long ago. Walked off with her kid." "With a little girl?" "Yeah. Small one. Wool hat." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Do you know where they live?" "Couple blocks that way," the driver said, pointing down the street. "Old apartments, near the corner store." "Thank you." Ethan turned to head back to the SUV when he noticed a small figure walking toward the empty sidewalk. A little girl. She slowed when she saw him standing there, clearly recognizing him as well. Ethan crouched slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. "Hi there." Annie nodded. "Hello." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "This might sound like a strange question, but did you happen to see a watch around here?" Annie tilted her head. "A watch?" "Yes." Ethan pointed toward the pavement near the curb. "I'm pretty sure I dropped it right here earlier when I stopped for a hot dog." He tried to describe it carefully. "It's gold, round face, brown leather strap. The back has small engraved markings around the edge. It's an old watch. It belonged to my father." Annie listened quietly. Then she nodded. "I saw it." Ethan blinked. "You did?" "Yes." Relief flickered across his face. "You picked it up?" Annie nodded again. "I did." Ethan looked around instinctively. "Do you still have it?" Annie shook her head. "No." His stomach dropped. "I took it home," she explained quickly. "I waited here for a while after you left, because I thought maybe you'd come back." She pointed toward the empty sidewalk. "But when you didn't come back, my mom and I packed up the cart and went home." Ethan listened carefully. Annie continued. "I didn't want anyone else to take it, so I put it on the table in our apartment. I was going to bring it to the police station tomorrow." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Then why did you come back here?" he asked gently. Annie held up the small cloth bag she was carrying. "I forgot the money bag from the cart," she said. "Mom sent me back to get it." She glanced at him again. "And then I saw you here." Then Annie studied him carefully. "You're the man who bought the hot dog earlier." Ethan nodded. "Yes. You dropped the watch when you got back in your car." Ethan gave a small, embarrassed smile. "That sounds about right." Annie thought for a second. "My apartment is only a few blocks away," she said finally. "The watch is there." Ethan looked down at her with quiet relief. "Well," he said softly, "that might be the best news I've heard all day." Ethan glanced toward his SUV, where Lily was still waiting inside. "Would it be all right?" he asked gently. "If I walked with you?" Annie looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. "I should get the money bag first," She stepped toward the side of the building where the hot dog cart usually stood and bent down beside a low concrete ledge. From behind a stack of flattened cardboard boxes, she pulled out a faded canvas pouch with a zipper that stuck halfway closed. "My mom hides things where people don't look," Annie said. Ethan almost smiled. "That sounds smart." "It is," Annie replied, with the matter-of-fact seriousness only children could carry so naturally. He opened the rear door of the SUV and leaned in. "Lily, we're going to make one quick stop." His daughter looked up from the book she had opened in the passenger seat. "Are we getting your watch back?" "I think so." Lily glanced toward Annie, then back at her father. "Can I come?" Ethan hesitated. The neighborhood was not dangerous in any obvious way, but it was cold, getting later, and unfamiliar to his daughter. Still, the walk was short, and something about leaving Lily alone in the car felt wrong. "Yes," he said at last, "but stay close." Lily climbed out and zipped her pink coat all the way to her chin. Annie looked at her, then at Ethan, and seemed to understand immediately that this was the daughter from the phone call. "You were late because of her," Annie said. Lily frowned. "Because of me?" Ethan put a hand lightly on Lily's shoulder. "Because I was trying to bring you dinner and I made a mess of things." That seemed to satisfy both girls. The four of them began walking down the block, though Renee was not with them. Ethan noticed that immediately. "Your mother let you come back alone?" he asked Annie. "She was closing the apartment window that gets stuck," Annie said. "And she knows I'm fast." Lily edged closer to her father and studied Annie openly. "You really found his watch?" she asked. Annie nodded. "I saw it fall." Lily looked impressed. "I didn't even know he lost it until ballet was over." Annie glanced sideways at her. He looked scared. Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I was. Because it was expensive?" Lily asked. "No," he said. He answered so quickly that both girls looked up at him. Then, after a pause, he added, "Because it belonged to my father." That quieted them. They reached a 3-story brick building with chipped paint around the entry door and a mailbox panel missing one brass flap. Annie climbed the front steps first, then pushed the door open with her shoulder. "It smells funny in the hallway," she said over her shoulder, as if warning guests. Lily whispered, "She's right." The hallway smelled faintly of old radiator heat, detergent, and something fried several hours earlier. A single overhead bulb buzzed weakly above the stairs. "Second floor," Annie said. Ethan followed behind the girls, one hand near Lily's back as they climbed. Each wooden step creaked under their feet. He was suddenly aware of how loud his own shoes sounded in a building like this. Too polished, too hard, too expensive. Annie stopped outside apartment 2B and knocked twice before opening the door. "Mom, I'm back." The apartment was small but warm. Not warm enough to be comfortable, Ethan noticed, but warmer than the street. A space heater hummed in the corner near a table with 2 mismatched chairs. A narrow sofa sat beneath the window, covered with a folded blanket. On the stove, a dented pot gave off the faint smell of broth. Renee Carter turned from the kitchenette the moment they entered. When she saw Ethan and Lily behind Annie, her body went completely still. Her eyes went first to Annie, then to the canvas money bag in her hand, then to Ethan. "Annie," she said carefully, "I told you to come right back." "I did," Annie answered quickly. But he was there. Renee's gaze sharpened. "Who?" "The man from the hot dog cart," Annie said. "The one who dropped the watch." For one brief moment, Ethan watched Renee's expression shift through 3 emotions at once: concern, recognition, and something else buried deeper. Something older. He stepped forward just enough to be respectful, not enough to feel invaded. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he said. "She found me before I had to keep asking for directions." Renee looked at him for a long second, then at Lily, then back again. "Well," she said at last, "you found the right apartment." Annie slipped out of her own coat and hung it carefully on a hook by the door. "The watch is on the table," she said. Ethan turned. On the small table near the window, beside a bowl of pennies and a grocery flyer, lay the watch. His father's watch. For a second he did not move. He simply looked at it, as though seeing an old friend returned from danger. If this moment touched your heart, please take a second to like the video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this. Then he crossed the room and picked it up. The metal felt cold against his skin. He turned it over slowly, checking the edge, the back, the worn leather strap, the same fine scratches, the same tiny mark near the clasp from the day he had dropped it on a marble floor 20 years earlier. A long breath left his chest. "Thank God," he murmured. Lily smiled. "You look better now." "I am better now." Renee dried her hands on a kitchen towel, still watching him. She said she was going to take it to the police station tomorrow if nobody came back. Ethan looked at Annie. "That's true?" Annie shrugged. "It didn't belong to us." There it was again. Simple, clear, uncomplicated in the way only true honesty could be. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and took out his wallet. "Then please let me thank you properly." Renee's posture stiffened immediately, but before she could speak, Annie shook her head. "No, sir." Ethan paused with the bills halfway out. "No?" Annie pointed lightly toward the watch in his hand. "If something belongs to somebody, you just give it back." Renee lowered her eyes for a moment, and Ethan had the strange feeling that he had just heard a child repeat a lesson taught many times in a home where money was scarce but dignity was not. He put the wallet away. "All right," he said quietly. "Then thank you has to be enough." Renee studied him again, then nodded once. "For tonight," she said. Ethan accepted that. Some debts deserved to remain humbling. Lily had wandered closer to the little table by the window. "This apartment is small," she whispered, not cruelly, only as a child observing the obvious. Renee gave a tired half-smile. "That happens sometimes." Lily looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean—" "It's all right," Renee said. Annie stepped toward a shelf near the sofa and reached for something Ethan hadn't noticed before. A second watch, older, more worn. She held it in both hands and looked up at him. "This is the one I told you about," she said. "My dad's." Ethan's eyes dropped to the object in her palms. And though he did not know it yet, the moment before him was already beginning to pull at the first loose thread in a secret that had been buried for years. Annie held the old watch in both hands the way some children held a photograph of someone they were afraid to forget. The apartment seemed to grow quieter around that small gesture. Even Lily, who had spent most of her life in rooms where adults filled silences quickly, said nothing. She only stood near her father and watched. Ethan looked at the worn watch in Annie's palms. At first, all he noticed was that it resembled his own. Round face, a narrow crown, a leather strap so old it had darkened near the buckle. But similarity alone meant nothing. Old watches often borrowed from old designs. People liked what lasted. That was all. Still, something in Annie's voice when she said my dad's had made him pay closer attention. "May I see it?" he asked gently. Annie looked up at her mother before answering. Renee did not speak at once. Her fingers tightened around the dish towel in her hand. Then, very slightly, she nodded. Annie stepped forward and placed the watch in Ethan's open palm. It was lighter than his own, more worn, and a little warmer from the heat of her hands. Ethan turned it over carefully. The back was scratched. The leather had cracked where it had been bent too often, but the structure of the case was unmistakably close to his own watch, close enough to feel less like coincidence and more like an echo. Lily leaned in. "It does look like yours." "Yes," Ethan said quietly. He pressed his thumb against the small latch and opened the cover. Inside, time shifted. The first thing he saw was the engraving. Not a full sentence, just a name and a date in letters so small they seemed almost private. Samuel. Below it, tucked beneath the inner rim, was a tiny photograph. Faded with age, but still visible. A young white man stood beside a younger black man. They were both smiling into the camera, one shoulder turned toward the other with the unconscious closeness of people bound by something easy and real. The photograph was grainy, the edges worn, but the face on the left struck Ethan so hard he forgot to breathe. His father, younger, leaner, less guarded than Ethan had ever known him. And beside him, Ethan stared harder. The second man had darker skin, broader shoulders, and a softer mouth. But the line of his jaw, the shape around the eyes, even the arch of the brow carried something painfully familiar. Not identical, but not unrelated. Something cold and electric moved down Ethan's spine. "Dad," Lily whispered. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Renee was watching him now with the steady look of a woman who had waited years for a moment she had prayed would never come. "Where did this come from?" Ethan asked at last. Annie answered before her mother could. "My daddy gave it to me." Ethan looked at her. "When?" "Before he died." Children could say things like that plainly, without performance. Their honesty made grief sound even heavier. Ethan closed the cover carefully. "What was your father's name?" This time Renee answered, "Samuel Carter." The name landed strangely. It was ordinary, almost modest. It did not belong beside the image in Ethan's mind of polished family portraits and old money rituals, and the severe silence of his father's study. "Carter," Ethan repeated. Renee's mouth tightened a little. That was the name he used. Used. The word hung there. Ethan lifted his eyes to hers. "What does that mean?" Renee looked toward Annie and Lily, two small girls standing in the same room but from such different worlds that the contrast almost hurt to witness. Then she looked back at Ethan. "It means," she said slowly, "that the name he was born with didn't do him much good." No one moved. The heater in the corner hummed and clicked. Somewhere upstairs, a television laughed too loudly through the ceiling, then faded again. Ethan felt a pressure building behind his ribs. "Mrs. Carter. Renee." He nodded. "Renee, I'm not trying to pry into something that isn't my business." Her expression changed almost invisibly, as if she wanted to say that it might be his business more than either of them liked. "But?" she asked. Ethan looked down at the photograph again. "But that man in this picture is my father." Lily's eyes widened. "Grandpa?" Ethan nodded once, still staring at the watch. Annie looked from him to her mother. "Then my daddy knew his daddy?" No one answered right away. Sometimes the truth entered a room before anyone could find decent words to dress it in. Renee crossed slowly to the small table and pulled out one of the chairs, lowering herself into it as if her legs had suddenly gone weak. She was not old, Ethan noticed, but fatigue had settled into her body in a way that could add years without permission. "Samuel told me this day might come," she said. Ethan looked up sharply. "He did?" She nodded. "Not like this. Not with Annie finding a watch on a sidewalk and bringing a billionaire to my apartment. But he always said the truth had a way of circling back when people got too comfortable burying it." Ethan heard the word billionaire and almost flinched. In boardrooms and news profiles it sounded neutral, even flattering. Here it sounded like distance, like accusation wrapped in fact. Lily climbed onto the sofa and sat quietly, sensing she was no longer in an ordinary adult conversation. Annie remained standing near her mother, one small hand resting against the woman's sleeve. Ethan spoke more softly now. "Who was Samuel, really?" Renee let out a breath through her nose. "A good man. A proud man. A man who worked harder than most men I've known and got less for it than he deserved. That's not what I meant." "I know." She looked directly at him. "Samuel was your father's son." The room held still. Ethan stared at her, certain he had heard the words, uncertain his mind had accepted them. "My father had no other children," he said automatically. It came out too quickly, too cleanly, the voice of old family certainty speaking before the man himself could think. Renee gave him a tired look that was not cruel, only unsurprised. "That's what you were told." Ethan's hand tightened around the worn watch. His first instinct was denial, not because the evidence meant nothing, but because it meant too much. His father had secrets. Of course he had secrets. Powerful men often did. But this, a son hidden outside the family, a whole second life pushed into silence. He heard his own voice from far away. "You're saying Samuel was my brother?" Renee shook her head once. "Half-brother." The word settled like stone. Lily whispered, "Dad." He could not look at her. Not yet. His mind had gone backward years at a time. Childhood summers at the lake house. Formal dinners. His father's measured voice. The family attorney, Victor Whitmore, always nearby with a folder in hand and an answer ready before anyone finished a question. The rules. The appearances. The unspoken understanding that the Whitmore name was to remain polished, untouched, above scandal and ordinary failure. And somewhere outside that clean, guarded life, another son had existed. A son Ethan had never been allowed to know. Annie, perhaps sensing the weight in the room without fully understanding it, looked up at him and asked the simplest question of all. "Did you know my daddy?" Ethan swallowed. "No," he said. The truth of it hurt more than he expected. Annie's face fell, but only for a second. Children knew how to receive disappointment quietly when life had trained them early. Renee rose from the chair and moved to the stove. Though Ethan could tell she wasn't really tending the pot so much as buying herself a moment to breathe. Samuel used to say your father visited sometimes when he was younger, she said without turning around. Private places, quiet places, never holidays, never anywhere that left a record worth keeping. Ethan felt suddenly unsteady. He never told me. No, Renee said. Men like him rarely tell the truth when it threatens the life they built. It was not a shouted accusation. That made it sharper. Ethan looked down at the two watches now in his hands, his father's and Samuel's, nearly alike. One preserved in privilege, the other worn thin by years of harder living. Two versions of the same inheritance. Two sons. Two lines of time that should never have been separated, yet were. Lily slid off the sofa and came to stand beside him. Dad. Are we related to Annie? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For all his wealth, for all his education, for all the endless practiced language of finance and power, he had no immediate words strong enough for the moment. Renee turned from the stove and faced him fully. You came here tonight looking for a watch, she said. Her voice was calm now, almost solemn, but I think you found something else. Ethan Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without his pulse changing. He had watched markets crash, competitors collapse, and reporters try to tear apart his company on live television. None of that had ever made his hands tremble. But now, standing in a small Detroit apartment with two watches in his hands, he felt something inside him shifting in a way he could not control. You came here tonight looking for a watch, Renee had said quietly. But I think you found something else. For a moment, Ethan could not answer. The heater hummed softly in the corner. Outside the apartment window, a car drove past slowly, tires crunching against the frozen street. Lily stood beside him, one small hand gripping the sleeve of his coat. Dad, is she really our cousin? Ethan looked down at Annie. The little girl stood very still, watching him with wide eyes that were far too calm for a child who had just heard something that could change her entire life. He had no prepared answer for that, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else that had happened tonight. He turned the worn watch over in his hand again. Samuel, the engraving stared back at him like a quiet accusation. My father never told me, Ethan said finally. Renee nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. He wouldn't. You sound very sure. I am. She leaned against the small kitchen counter, arms folded loosely. Your father was not a cruel man, she said. Samuel never said he was, but he was careful. Careful men sometimes choose silence when honesty becomes inconvenient. Ethan absorbed the words. They did not feel like anger. They felt like truth worn smooth by time. What happened to Samuel? He asked. Renee glanced at Annie before answering. Work accident, she said. Construction site. Faulty scaffolding. Ethan frowned slightly. When? 8 years ago. 8 years. Ethan's mind raced backward through board meetings, international flights, press conferences, charity galas. 8 years ago, his father had still been alive then. The family had gathered every Thanksgiving at the lake house. Victor Whitmore, the family's longtime attorney, had still been managing the trust. Not once had anyone mentioned another son. Ethan looked at the photograph again. You're certain this is my father? He asked quietly. Renee gave him a tired smile. Samuel kept that watch like it was a treasure. He opened it every year on Annie's birthday and told her stories about the man in that photograph. What kind of stories? The kind children deserve, Renee replied. About courage, about building something from nothing, about a man who believed family mattered. The irony in her voice was soft, but it was there. Lily had moved closer to Annie now. Your dad sounds nice, Lily said. Annie nodded. He was. Do you remember him? A little. Annie sat down on the sofa and tucked her feet under the blanket. He used to fix things, she continued. Broken chairs, broken lamps. He said if something could still work, you shouldn't throw it away. Ethan listened carefully. That sounded exactly like something his father would have said. The same philosophy he had used when rebuilding failing companies. Repair first. Replace only when necessary. The thought made Ethan uneasy, because it suggested something deeper than coincidence. Renee noticed the expression on his face. You're starting to see it, aren't you? See what? that Samuel wasn't imagining things. Ethan looked up sharply. You think my father actually knew about him? Renee gave a quiet laugh that carried no humor. Samuel didn't think it. He knew it. She walked to a small cabinet above the sink and opened it. From inside, she pulled a thin envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. She placed it carefully on the table. Samuel kept this. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a folded letter written in careful handwriting. The signature at the bottom made his stomach tighten. William Whitmore, his father. Ethan read the first line silently. Samuel, I regret that our circumstances make it difficult for us to speak openly. He stopped. The words blurred for a moment. Renee watched him closely. Your father sent that 20 years ago, she said. After Samuel tried to contact him, why didn't he bring Samuel into the family? Renee did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the apartment door, because someone made sure he didn't. Ethan looked up. Who? Renee met his eyes. Victor Whitmore. The name dropped into the room like a stone. Ethan straightened slowly. Victor is our family lawyer. Yes. He's been with us since I was a child. Yes. That doesn't mean he told you everything, Renee finished calmly. Silence stretched across the apartment. Victor Whitmore. Ethan pictured the man clearly. Tall, silver-haired, always perfectly dressed, always present when family matters were discussed. Victor had handled his father's estate. Victor had structured the trust funds. Victor had overseen every legal document connected to the Whitmore name. If Samuel truly existed as Renee claimed, Victor would absolutely have known. Ethan felt a slow anger beginning to rise beneath his confusion. You're telling me Victor kept my father's other son a secret for 20 years? Renee shook her head slightly. I'm telling you, Samuel believed. Victor convinced your father that acknowledging him publicly would destroy the Whitmore reputation. Lily frowned. How could a person destroy a reputation? The adults did not answer right away, because the truth was not simple enough for a 7-year-old. Ethan looked down again at the 2 watches in his hands. His father's, Samuel's. 2 nearly identical pieces of time, 2 different lives, 2 sons, and somewhere in the middle of that history stood Victor Whitmore, holding the authority to shape what the world knew. Ethan felt something shift inside him. For the first time tonight, the panic he had felt about losing the watch began transforming into something else. Determination. He placed Samuel's watch gently back into Annie's hands. You should keep this safe, he said. Annie nodded. I always do. Then she looked up at him. Are you mad? Ethan blinked. Mad? At my daddy, she said softly. For being your brother. The question struck him harder than any accusation. He crouched down so he was level with her. No, he said. Not at him. Then who? Ethan stood again slowly. His gaze moved toward the window where the cold Detroit night had settled fully over the street. Right now, he said quietly. I think I need to have a very serious conversation with someone who should have told me the truth a long time ago. Ethan Whitmore stepped out into the cold Detroit night with the 2 watches still heavy in his thoughts. The hallway behind him closed with a soft click as the door to Renee Carter's apartment shut. For a moment he simply stood on the narrow front steps of the building, letting the winter air steady his breathing. Across the street the city moved the way it always did at night, slow headlights drifting through intersections, the distant rumble of buses, a faint siren echoing somewhere several blocks away. But inside Ethan's mind, nothing was steady. Samuel, the name repeated itself again and again. Samuel Whitmore, or Samuel Carter, his father's hidden son, his half-brother, 8 years dead, and a 6-year-old girl upstairs who might be the only living proof that he had ever existed. Lily tugged gently at Ethan's sleeve. Dad? He looked down. His daughter's eyes were wide with curiosity, but also with something deeper concern. You're thinking really hard again. Ethan exhaled slowly. Yeah, he admitted. They walked back toward the SUV together, their footsteps crunching lightly over thin ice along the sidewalk. Lily climbed into the passenger seat while Ethan paused outside the car for a moment longer, staring at the dark apartment window on the 2nd floor. A small light flickered on behind the curtain. Renee was probably making dinner. Annie would be sitting nearby, holding that old watch like a treasure. And somewhere between those 2 watches lay a secret his family had buried for decades. Ethan finally slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The heater hummed to life. Lily watched him carefully. So, Annie is our cousin? Ethan rested his hands on the steering wheel. I don't know yet. But you think maybe? Yes. Lily considered that. Then she should come to my school sometime. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the statement. Why? So she won't be lonely. The innocence in the answer hit him harder than anything Renee had said. Children didn't understand reputation, or inheritance, or why powerful families sometimes erased the inconvenient pieces of their own history. To Lily, Annie was simply another child who deserved to belong somewhere. Ethan pulled the SUV away from the curb and turned toward the main road. Detroit's downtown lights glowed ahead in the distance. He already knew where he was going next. Victor Whitmore's office. Victor had been the Whitmore family's legal advisor for nearly 30 years. He handled the estate, the trusts, the corporate filings, every document that protected the family's name. If anyone knew about Samuel, Victor knew. 20 minutes later, Ethan's car turned into the quiet street where the Whitmore Capital offices stood. The tall glass building reflected the city lights like a mirror. Most floors were dark now, but a few windows on the upper levels still glowed. Victor often worked late. Ethan parked and stepped out. Lily looked up at the tower through the windshield. Are we going inside? Just for a minute. They entered through the lobby doors where a security guard sat behind the reception desk. Evening, Mr. Whitmore. Ethan nodded. Victor still here? The guard checked a screen. Yes, sir. Top floor. Ethan pressed the elevator button. As the doors closed, Lily whispered, Is Victor nice? Ethan considered the question. Sometimes. The elevator hummed upward. Floor numbers blinked one by one. When the doors opened on the top level, the hallway lights were dim and quiet. At the far end, a single office lamp glowed behind a glass wall. Victor Whitmore sat at his desk exactly the way Ethan remembered. From childhood perfect posture, silver hair neatly combed, a stack of papers arranged in precise lines. He looked up as Ethan entered. Well, Victor said pleasantly, this is a surprise. Then his eyes moved to Lily. And you brought company. Ethan didn't bother with small talk. I need to ask you about someone. Victor folded his hands calmly. Of course. Ethan stepped closer to the desk. Samuel. The name hung in the air. For the first time since Ethan had known him, Victor Whitmore did not answer immediately. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough. Victor leaned back slowly in his chair. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Lily looked from one man to the other. Who's Samuel? Victor gave her a polite smile. No one important, I'm afraid. Ethan's voice hardened. That's not what I heard tonight. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. And where exactly were you tonight, Ethan? Ethan didn't break eye contact. In an apartment a few blocks from Jefferson Avenue. Victor's fingers tightened almost invisibly, with a woman named Renee Carter. Now the room was truly silent. Victor stood slowly. That, he said carefully, is a very unfortunate coincidence. Ethan shook his head. No. He reached into his coat pocket and placed his father's watch on the desk. It's not. Victor looked down at the watch. His expression remained controlled, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to recognition. Ethan leaned forward. She showed me another watch tonight. Victor did not speak. Ethan continued quietly. Inside it was a photograph of my father, standing next to a man named Samuel. Victor finally looked up. And Renee says Samuel was my father's son. Lily gasped softly. Victor Whitmore stared at Ethan for a long moment. Then he sitted. The sound was slow, heavy, and tired. I wondered how long it would take, he said. Ethan's chest tightened. You knew. Victor walked to the window and looked down at the city lights. Yes, he said quietly. I knew. The confession settled over the office like a storm cloud. Ethan's voice dropped. You hid him. Victor did not turn around. I protected your family. The words ignited something in Ethan. By pretending my brother didn't exist? Victor finally faced him again. You didn't have a brother. Ethan's fist struck the desk before he realized he had moved. I do now. Victor's eyes moved briefly toward Lily, then back to Ethan. You should not be having this conversation in front of your daughter. Ethan's voice was cold. You should have had it with me 20 years ago. Victor said nothing, but the silence between them had changed. Because now Ethan knew something he hadn't known before. Samuel had been real. Victor Whitmore had known, and the truth his family buried all those years ago had just begun to rise back to the surface. Victor Whitmore had spent 40 years mastering the art of calm, even when companies collapsed, even when lawsuits threatened fortunes, even when reporters demanded answers that could ruin reputations. But as Ethan Whitmore stood across the desk from him, Victor could feel something he had not felt in a very long time. Pressure. Not panic. Not yet. But pressure. You knew, Ethan had said. Victor turned slowly from the window and faced him again. Yes, he replied. The words sat heavily in the quiet office. Behind Ethan, Lily shifted uneasily in the chair near the wall. She was trying very hard to understand a conversation meant for adults, but children often heard the emotional truth long before they understood the facts. Victor noticed that. Ethan, he said carefully, your daughter shouldn't be here for this discussion. Ethan didn't even glance back. My daughter is here because I had to pick her up from ballet, he said, which is the only reason I stopped for a hot dog tonight. Victor's brow tightened slightly. A hot dog? Yes. And because of that, Ethan continued quietly, I met my brother's daughter. Victor said nothing. Silence sometimes revealed more than denial. Ethan leaned forward again, both hands resting on the desk. You erased him. Victor sighed and walked back toward his chair. That is a very dramatic way of describing what happened. Then explain it. Victor sat down and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with slow precision. Samuel Whitmore, he said calmly, was the result of a mistake your father made long before you were born. Lily frowned. What mistake? Neither man answered her immediately. Victor continued speaking as though explaining a difficult but necessary lesson. Your father was a young man at the time, ambitious, building the foundation of what would eventually become the Whitmore business empire. He folded his hands on the desk. The woman involved was not socially compatible with the future your father was working toward. Ethan felt a sharp anger spark in his chest. You mean she wasn't rich? Victor raised an eyebrow. Among other things. And Samuel? Victor's voice remained even. Samuel was raised by his mother. Your father provided financial assistance for several years. That's not what the letter says. Victor's eyes flicked toward him. The letter? Ethan reached into his coat and pulled the folded paper Renee had given him. He placed it on the desk beside the watch. Victor looked down at it. Recognition crossed his face immediately. So, he murmured. She kept that. Ethan's jaw tightened. She? Renee. Victor leaned back in his chair. She was always determined. Ethan's patience was thinning rapidly. You're avoiding the point. No, Victor replied. I'm approaching it carefully. Lily raised her hand suddenly. Both men looked at her. Why didn't Grandpa just say Samuel was his son? Victor looked at the child for a long moment. Because the world is not always kind, he said finally. That doesn't answer the question. Ethan almost smiled despite the tension. Victor Sahil. The truth is simple, Ethan. Your father loved Samuel in his own way, but publicly acknowledging him would have created complications. What kind of complications? Legal ones. Ethan felt the answer forming before Victor even finished the sentence. Inheritance. Victor didn't deny it. At the time, he said calmly, your father was preparing to secure the Whitmore assets into a family trust. Adding another heir, especially one born outside the marriage, would have created significant challenges. So you convinced him to pretend Samuel didn't exist. I convinced him to protect the future of the Whitmore family. Ethan's hand slammed lightly against the desk. He was part of that family. Victor's expression remained cool. In blood, perhaps. The words hung in the air like frost. Ethan took a slow breath. You let my brother grow up thinking he was nothing. Victor's voice sharpened slightly. That is not what happened. Then tell me what did. Victor leaned forward. Samuel was offered money. Ethan blinked. What? A settlement, Victor explained. A generous one, enough to start a business, move anywhere he wished, build a comfortable life, and he refused. Ethan frowned. Why? Victor gave a small shrug. Pride. The word landed heavily. Samuel wanted recognition, Victor continued. He wanted the Whitmore name. Your father feared the consequences of giving it to him. Lily whispered softly. That's sad. Neither man corrected her. Victor rubbed his temple. For years, the arrangement remained quiet. Your father sent letters, sometimes money. Samuel occasionally responded. And then? Victor's gaze drifted briefly toward the watch on the desk. And then Samuel stopped writing. Because he died, Ethan said quietly. Yes. Ethan's chest tightened again. Did my father know? Victor hesitated. That hesitation answered the question. Ethan felt something inside him shift. My father died believing his son was still alive. Victor said nothing. The silence confirmed it. Lily looked confused. Wait, she said slowly. If Samuel was your brother, then Annie is family. Victor glanced toward her again. Yes, and she sells hot dogs outside in the cold. Victor's expression hardened. Life is rarely fair. Ethan stared at him. You could have changed that. Victor spread his hand slightly. I protected what I was hired to protect. The Whitmore name. Yes. Ethan looked down at the two watches again. One polished, one worn. Two lives divided by a decision made in a quiet office like this one many years ago. You know what the problem with that is? Ethan said quietly. Victor raised an eyebrow. What? You protected the name, Ethan said, but you forgot the people who were supposed to carry it. Victor's expression darkened slightly. And what exactly are you planning to do about that now? Ethan met his gaze. I'm going to start by telling the truth. Victor laughed softly. That would be inconvenient. For who? For everyone. Ethan picked up the watch from the desk. For Samuel, he said quietly. The inconvenience already happened. Lily slid out of her chair and walked over to her father. Dad. Yes? When can Annie come over? Victor looked at the child as if she had just spoken a foreign language, but Ethan answered without hesitation. Soon, he said, because whether Victor Whitmore liked it or not, the Whitmore family had just grown larger, and this time, Ethan had no intention of pretending otherwise. Victor Whitmore had expected anger. He had expected accusations. What he had not expected was Ethan Whitmore walking out of the office without another word. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan and Lily, and the quiet hum of the building swallowed the tension that had filled the room moments before. Victor remained standing beside his desk for a long time. Through the tall glass windows, the lights of Detroit shimmered across the river like scattered coins. The city had always looked peaceful from this height. Distant problems were easier to ignore when viewed from 40 floors above the street. But tonight, something felt different. Victor adjusted his cufflinks slowly. Truth, he murmured to himself. Ethan had used that word as if it were a weapon. Victor had spent most of his career understanding the danger of truth, not the kind people told at dinner tables. The other kind, the kind that appeared in courtrooms, newspapers, inheritance claims, and shareholder meetings. Truth could destroy reputations. Truth could fracture families. Truth could cost billions. And now Ethan Whitmore seemed determined to open a door that had been carefully sealed for decades. Victor exhaled slowly and returned to his chair. The watches were gone, both of them. That alone told him Ethan was serious. Meanwhile, the elevator carried Ethan and Lily down through the quiet building. Neither of them spoke during the ride. When the doors opened in the lobby, Lily slipped her hand into Ethan's. Dad? Yes? Are you mad at Victor? Ethan considered the question. Yes, he said finally. But not only at him. Who else? Ethan pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the cold night air. Sometimes, he said quietly, families make mistakes they don't know how to fix. Lily thought about that. Then she asked the question children always asked when adults spoke in confusing circles. Are we going to fix it? Ethan looked down at her. Her eyes were serious. Hopeful. He realized something in that moment. Lily didn't care about inheritance laws or corporate reputations. She cared about Annie, about whether a girl she had just met might belong somewhere. Yes, Ethan said softly. We are. They climbed into the SUV. The engine started with a low rumble, and warm air began filling the car. Ethan rested his hands on the steering wheel but didn't drive yet. Instead, he looked at the watch his father had given him. The metal reflected the dashboard lights. For years, he had believed that watch represented legacy. Now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it represented something unfinished. Lily leaned back in her seat. Do you think Annie is awake? Ethan glanced at the clock. It was getting late. Probably. Can we go back? Ethan smiled slightly. Already? You said we were going to fix things. He couldn't argue with that. 15 minutes later, the SUV rolled quietly back onto the same narrow street where Renee Carter's apartment building stood. The lights in the second-floor window were still on. Ethan parked and turned off the engine. You wait here this time, he told Lily gently. She nodded but added, Tell Annie I said hi. I will. Ethan stepped out of the car and climbed the familiar creaking steps once again. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking soup and radiator heat. He knocked on the door. Inside, footsteps approached. The door opened a moment later. Renee Carter looked surprised to see him again. That was fast. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. I had a conversation I needed to have. Judging by your face, she said. It didn't go well. Not exactly. She stepped aside and let him enter. Annie sat cross-legged on the sofa, the old watch still in her hands. She looked up immediately. You found your office? Ethan laughed quietly. Yes. Did you talk to the man who knew about my dad? I did. Annie tilted her head. Was he nice? Ethan paused. He was honest. That seemed like the better answer. Renee closed the door behind him. And now? She asked. Ethan looked around the small apartment again. The worn furniture, the space heater humming beside the table, the grocery flyer still lying where he had seen it earlier. This place had held a secret his entire life. A secret that should have belonged to him too. Now it did. Now, Ethan said slowly, I think we need to talk about Samuel. Renee folded her arms. We already did. Not enough. Annie climbed off the sofa and walked closer. My daddy liked stories, she said. Ethan crouched down slightly so he could look her in the eyes. So did mine. Annie smiled a little. Maybe they would have been friends. The thought hit Ethan harder than expected. Yes, he said quietly. I think they would have. Renee studied him carefully. You came back for a reason. I did. And that reason is? Ethan stood again. To make sure Annie knows something Samuel never got to hear enough. Renee's eyes narrowed slightly. What's that? Ethan looked down at the child standing between them. That she belongs to this family. The apartment fell completely silent. Renee stared at him as if trying to decide whether he meant it, because promises made by wealthy men had broken many lives before. Finally, she asked the only question that mattered. And what happens when the rest of your family disagrees? Ethan looked toward the window, where the lights of the city flickered in the distance. Then he answered calmly, Then they'll have to learn something my daughter already understands. Renee waited. Ethan smiled faintly. That the truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Annie held the old watch a little tighter. Time had kept its secret for years. But tonight, the story had finally begun to move again. Ethan Whitmore did not leave the Carter apartment quickly this time. Instead, he sat at the small kitchen table while Renee poured 3 cups of weak coffee into mismatched mugs. The heater hummed softly near the wall, and Annie had returned to the sofa, carefully polishing the glass of her father's watch with the sleeve of her sweater the way a child protects something sacred. Outside, the Detroit night had deepened. Snow drifted slowly past the streetlight outside the window. For a moment, no one spoke. Renee finally slid a mug across the table toward Ethan. You don't look like a man who just solved his problem, she said. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm cup. That's because I didn't. He stared into the coffee for a second. I confirmed it. Renee's eyes narrowed slightly. Confirmed what? That Samuel was my father's son. She leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. And Victor knew. The words carried a quiet weight. Renee did not look surprised. I figured he did. You knew about Victor? Samuel mentioned him once, she said. Said there was always a lawyer involved whenever your father wrote. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like Victor. Across the room, Annie looked up from the watch. Is Victor the man who didn't want my dad to have your last name? The simplicity of the question made Ethan pause. Yes, he said. Annie frowned slightly. That's not very nice. Renee gave a soft sigh. No, she agreed. It wasn't. The apartment fell quiet again. Then Annie spoke once more. My dad said names are important. Ethan turned toward her. Did he? She nodded. He said a name tells people where you come from, but it shouldn't decide where you go. Renee looked down at the table. Samuel had said that many times. Ethan felt the words settle somewhere deep in his chest. Your dad sounds like a wise man. Annie smiled a little. He fixed things too. I heard. He said broken things deserve a second chance. Ethan glanced down at the 2 watches again. His father's, Samuel's, 2 versions of the same history. 2 men who should have known each other as brothers. Instead, one had lived in glass towers. The other had built scaffolding in the cold. Renee noticed where his thoughts had gone. You're blaming your father, she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. No. Victor then? Partly. Renee lifted one eyebrow. Partly? Ethan leaned back in the chair. My father made the decision, he said. Victor just made it easier. That answer seemed to satisfy her. So what happens now? She asked. Ethan hesitated, because the truth was he didn't know yet. Not completely. But he did know one thing. He looked toward Annie again. The girl had now climbed onto the floor and was showing the old watch to Lily through the open apartment door. At some point, Lily had slipped quietly upstairs from the car and knocked on the door without Ethan noticing. The two girls sat cross-legged, whispering over the watches like archaeologists studying treasure. Ethan couldn't help smiling at the sight. Children accepted truth faster than adults ever could. They seem to like each other, Renee said. They do. That might complicate things for you. Ethan chuckled quietly. My life has been complicated since the moment I stepped into this apartment. Renee folded her arms. You still haven't answered my question. What question? What happens now? Ethan was about to respond when his phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He glanced down. The caller ID read, Victor Whitmore. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment. Then he answered, Yes? Victor's voice came through calm but tight. You need to come back to the office. Ethan frowned. It's late. This can't wait. What is it? There was a brief pause. Then Victor said something that made Ethan sit up straight. The board just received a call from a reporter. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What reporter? One who seems to know the name Samuel Whitmore. The apartment suddenly felt colder. Ethan stood slowly. How? That's exactly what we need to discuss. Victor's voice lowered. If this story becomes public, Ethan, it will not only affect your family. What do you mean? It could trigger legal claims on the Whitmore estate. Inheritance, lawsuits, media attention. Everything Victor had warned about earlier. Ethan glanced toward Annie and Lily again. The two girls were laughing softly now, oblivious. Victor continued speaking. You may want to think carefully before you turn a family secret into a public crusade. Ethan's jaw tightened. That reporter, he said quietly. What's his name? Victor hesitated, then answered, Daniel Brooks. Ethan froze, because that name sounded familiar, very familiar. He had heard it once already tonight. At the police station where Annie had first brought the watch. Ethan ended the call slowly. Renee watched him carefully. That didn't sound good. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. No, he said. It didn't. Annie looked up from the floor. Are you leaving again? Ethan crouched down beside her. For a little while, she held up the old watch. My dad used to say time tells the truth eventually. Ethan smiled faintly. He was right. Then he stood and turned toward the door. Because somewhere in Detroit, a reporter had just begun asking questions about a man named Samuel Whitmore. And once questions like that started moving through a city, they rarely stopped. Ethan Whitmore had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments in business were not the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The moments when a single piece of information appeared unexpectedly, like a crack forming in glass that had always looked solid. Standing in the Carter apartment hallway, Ethan felt that crack widening. A reporter asking about Samuel Whitmore. That meant the past was already moving. Renee watched him carefully. You look like someone just moved the ground under your feet. Ethan exhaled slowly. Something like that. Annie and Lily were still sitting on the floor inside the living room, whispering over the watches. Lily was trying on Annie's wool hat, while Annie explained how the watch cover opened to reveal the photograph. Children did not understand the storm building around them, and Ethan wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. He turned back to Renee. A reporter called my office tonight. Her expression changed immediately. A reporter? Yes. About Samuel? Ethan nodded. Renee's shoulders stiffened. That's not good. No, Ethan said. It isn't. She crossed her arms slowly. How would a reporter even know Samuel's name? That's exactly the question I'm trying to answer. Annie suddenly looked up. Is someone in trouble? Ethan forced a small smile. No, sweetheart. Then why do you look worried? He crouched down beside her again. Sometimes adults worry too much about things that already happened. Annie considered that. My dad used to say worrying doesn't fix anything. Ethan smiled faintly. Your dad sounds smarter than most CEOs I know. She didn't know what a CEO was, but she nodded anyway. Lily stood up and walked toward her father. Are you leaving again? For a little while. Business? Something like that. Lily thought about it. Is it about Annie? Ethan looked at the two girls standing side by side. Two children who had met only hours ago but already looked like old friends. Yes, he said softly. It is. 20 minutes later, Ethan was driving back toward downtown Detroit. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting across the windshield under the streetlights. His mind replayed Victor's words. A reporter named Daniel Brooks. The name bothered him, not just because reporters caused problems for billion-dollar companies, but because Ethan had heard the name earlier tonight. At the police station, Officer Daniel Brooks, the The man who had taken Annie's statement when she returned the watch. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 2 men with the same name? Possible, but unlikely. When he reached the Whitmore Capitol building again, the lobby guard looked up in mild surprise. Back again tonight, Mr. Whitmore? Yeah. Mr. Whitmore Sr. still upstairs. Ethan nodded and walked straight to the elevator. This time, Lily stayed in the car. When the elevator doors opened, Victor was already standing in the hallway outside his office. He looked tense in a way Ethan had never seen before. That was quick, Victor said. You sounded worried. I am. They walked into the office. Victor closed the door behind them. Sit down. Ethan didn't sit. Tell me about the reporter. Victor picked up a tablet from his desk and turned the screen toward him. His name is Daniel Brooks, Victor said. Yes, you mentioned that. He's a local investigative journalist, used to work for the Detroit Free Press. Now he runs an independent media outlet online. Ethan scanned the screen. Brooks had written dozens of articles. Corporate corruption, hidden assets, legal loopholes, stories that had embarrassed powerful companies. What exactly did he ask? Ethan said. Victor's voice lowered. He asked whether Whitmore Capital had ever provided financial support to a man named Samuel Whitmore. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. And? I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. Ethan frowned. You lied. Victor met his eyes calmly. I protected the firm. Ethan shook his head slowly. That story is already moving. Yes, Victor said. Which means we need to stop it before it becomes public. How? Victor leaned forward. There are several ways. Ethan did not like the tone in his voice. Victor, first, Victor continued, we can challenge the reporter legally, threaten a defamation lawsuit. And if that doesn't work, Victor paused. There are other options. Ethan stared at him. You're not seriously suggesting we intimidate a journalist. Victor's expression hardened. I'm suggesting we protect the Whitmore name. The Whitmore name already survived hiding a son for 30 years. Victor's eyes flashed. You think the public will see it that way? Yes. They won't, Victor said sharply. They'll see a billionaire family hiding a black heir outside the inheritance structure. Do you understand what that headline will do? Ethan didn't answer, because Victor was right about one thing. The story would explode, but not for the reasons Victor feared. It would explode because the truth had been buried. Ethan walked toward the window. Detroit's skyline stretched across the river in a field of lights. Somewhere out there, Annie Carter was probably brushing her teeth before bed, completely unaware that the world might soon learn her father's name. Victor spoke again. You need to make a decision tonight. Ethan turned. What decision? Whether Samuel Whitmore becomes a story. The room went silent. For years, Ethan had believed the Whitmore legacy was about success, about discipline, about reputation. Now he realized it was also about something else. Courage. He looked back at Victor. You said earlier that you protected my family. Yes. Ethan nodded once. Then it's my turn. Victor frowned. What does that mean? Ethan picked up his father's watch from the desk. It means, he said quietly, that if a reporter is asking about Samuel Whitmore, Victor's face tightened, then maybe it's time someone finally answers the question. Outside the office windows, snow continued falling over the city, and somewhere in Detroit, a journalist named Daniel Brooks was already pulling at the thread that could unravel 30 years of silence. Ethan Whitmore stood beside the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, watching snow settle across the Detroit skyline. The city looked calm, peaceful even, but Ethan had spent enough years in business to know that calm was often just the moment before everything changed. Behind him, Victor Whitmore sat at the desk with the stillness of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. You're making a mistake, Victor said quietly. Ethan didn't turn around. That depends on what you think the mistake is. The mistake, Victor replied, is believing the truth always improves a situation. Ethan finally faced him. And the alternative? Control the narrative. Victor tapped the tablet on his desk. We deny Samuel Whitmore existed. We challenge the reporter's credibility. The story dies before it reaches the public. Ethan crossed the room slowly. You really think that would work now? It has worked for 30 years. The words were calm, too calm. Ethan stopped beside the desk. For 30 years, he said. Samuel lived without the name that belonged to him. Victor's expression did not change. He lived the life his choices allowed. Ethan's voice sharpened. You mean the life we forced him into? Victor's eyes hardened slightly. No, I mean the life he chose when he refused the settlement your father offered. Ethan picked up the watch from the desk again. You keep saying that like money replaces belonging. Victor leaned back. In the real world, Mr. Whitmore, money replaces most things. Ethan looked down at the watch. The metal reflected the soft office lights. Samuel's watch had looked nearly identical. 2 brothers, 2 lives, 2 very different outcomes. I met his daughter tonight, Ethan said quietly. Victor did not respond. She's 6 years old. Still nothing. She was selling hot dogs with her mother in the cold. Victor hid. I'm aware the situation is emotionally difficult for you. It's not difficult. Ethan met his eyes. It's clear. Victor studied him carefully now. Then let me be equally clear. He stood slowly. If that reporter publishes this story, the Whitmore estate could face legal challenges. Ethan folded his arms. From who? From Samuel's heirs. Ethan blinked. He only had Annie. Exactly. Victor's voice lowered. And if Annie Carter is legally recognized as Samuel Whitmore's daughter, he paused. She could have a claim on the Whitmore family trust. The sentence hung in the room like a quiet explosion. Ethan stared at him. You're worried about inheritance. I'm worried about the stability of the Whitmore Corporation. Victor walked toward the window. Your father structured the family assets very carefully. Introducing a new legal heir decades later could create enormous complications. Ethan almost laughed. So, the real concern is money. Victor turned. The real concern is everything. Ethan walked slowly back toward the desk. You know what's interesting? Victor said nothing. When I was a kid, Ethan continued, my father used to tell me something about responsibility. Victor waited. He said if you're strong enough to build something, you're strong enough to carry the consequences of it. Victor's mouth tightened slightly. That's a very noble philosophy. It's also practical. Ethan picked up his phone. Victor frowned. What are you doing? I'm calling the reporter. Victor's reaction was immediate. No. Ethan dialed anyway. The phone rang once, twice. Then a calm voice answered. Daniel Brooks. Ethan spoke clearly. This is Ethan Whitmore. There was a pause on the other end. Then Brooks replied slowly. I was wondering when you might call. Victor stared at him in disbelief. Ethan walked toward the window again. I hear you've been asking questions about a man named Samuel Whitmore. Brooks didn't hesitate. That's correct. What exactly do you want to know? The truth. Ethan glanced back at Victor. The lawyer's face had gone pale in a way Ethan had never seen before. Ethan returned his attention to the phone. Then maybe we should meet. Another pause. Where? Brooks asked. Ethan looked out across the snowy city. Tomorrow morning, he said. There's a hot dog stand on Jefferson Avenue. Victor's eyes widened. Ethan continued calmly. Be there at 9. Brooks laughed quietly. That's not the location I expected. It's the location where the story began. Ethan ended the call. The office was silent again. Victor spoke slowly. You just invited a journalist to expose the Whitmore family secret. Ethan slipped the watch back onto his wrist. No. He walked toward the door. I invited him to hear the truth. Victor's voice followed him across the room. And if that truth destroys everything your father built? Ethan stopped at the doorway. For a moment he looked down at the watch on his wrist. Then he answered, if the truth can destroy it. He opened the door. Then maybe it wasn't built strong enough to last. The door closed behind him. Victor Whitmore stood alone in the quiet office, staring at the empty hallway. For the first time in 30 years, the story he had buried was about to return. And this time, it wasn't coming quietly. Morning arrived slowly over Detroit. Snow had stopped during the night, leaving the streets quiet and pale beneath a gray winter sky. Cars moved cautiously along Jefferson Avenue, their tires hissing over the thin layer of ice that clung to the pavement. The hot dog cart stood in its usual place near the bus stop. Steam curled upward from the grill. Renee Carter worked with steady hands, turning sausages and warming buns while Annie arranged napkins neatly beside the metal tray. The small red cart looked exactly the same as it had the day before, as if the world had not shifted overnight. But today, something was different. A black SUV rolled slowly to the curb across the street. Ethan Whitmore stepped out first. Behind him, Lily climbed out and zipped her coat against the cold. Renee noticed them immediately. Her shoulders tightened slightly. You came back early, she said when Ethan approached. I said I would. Annie looked up and smiled. Hi again. Hi, Annie. Lily waved enthusiastically. Good morning. Renee studied Ethan carefully. You look like a man who didn't sleep much. I didn't. Before she could ask anything else, another car pulled up behind Ethan's SUV, a gray sedan. A tall man stepped out holding a leather messenger bag and a camera slung over his shoulder. Daniel Brooks. He paused beside the sidewalk and glanced around the street before walking toward them. His eyes moved quickly, first to Ethan, then to Renee, then to Annie. Finally, he spoke. So this is where the story begins. Ethan nodded. Yes. Brooks offered a polite smile to Renee. Daniel Brooks. I know who you are, she replied calmly. That seemed to surprise him. I guess the internet works everywhere now. Renee turned another hot dog on the grill. It does. Brooks looked back at Ethan. Mind if I record this conversation? Ethan shook his head. No. Brooks pulled a small recorder from his bag and placed it on the edge of the cart. All right then, he said. He clicked the device on. Let's start simple. His eyes settled on Ethan. Is it true that Samuel Whitmore was the son of William Whitmore? The question hung in the cold air. Cars passed slowly along the street. A bus rumbled to a stop nearby. Annie watched the adults carefully. Ethan didn't hesitate. Yes. Brooks raised an eyebrow. That was easier than I expected. Ethan glanced at Annie. Some truth should never have been hidden in the first place. Brooks nodded slowly. So Samuel Whitmore existed. Yes, and he was never acknowledged publicly by the Whitmore family. That's correct. Brooks scribbled something in a small notebook. Why? Ethan took a breath. Because powerful families sometimes protect their reputation more carefully than their people. Brooks looked impressed. That's a headline. Ethan gave a faint smile. You asked for the truth. Brooks turned toward Renee. And Samuel? Renee didn't stop working the grill. He worked construction. Did he ever try to claim the Whitmore name? Yes. And? She glanced briefly at Ethan. He was told it would be complicated. Brooks nodded. That's a polite way of describing discrimination. Renee didn't respond. Annie tugged lightly on her sleeve. Mom? Yes. Can I say something? Renee hesitated. Then she nodded. Brooks looked surprised as Annie stepped closer to the recorder. My dad said names are important, she said. The journalist crouched slightly so he could hear her better. What else did he say? Annie thought for a moment. He said sometimes grown-ups hide things because they're scared. Brooks glanced toward Ethan. That sounds accurate. Ethan didn't argue. Lily leaned toward Annie. You're doing great. Brooks turned back to Ethan. One more question. Go ahead. If this story becomes public, the Whitmore estate could face legal challenges. I know. You're prepared for that? Ethan nodded. Yes. Why? Ethan looked down at the watch on his wrist. The same watch his father had given him years ago. For the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of power. It felt like a reminder of responsibility. He looked back at Brooks. Because Samuel deserved to be part of the family that carried his blood. Brooks scribbled another note. And Annie? Ethan glanced toward the little girl standing beside the cart. She was watching him with quiet curiosity. Annie deserves the truth about where she comes from. The street had grown quieter while they talked. People waiting at the bus stop were beginning to notice the conversation. Phones appeared. Photos were taken. Brooks turned off the recorder. Well, he said, that's going to change a lot of things. Ethan nodded. Yes. Brooks slid the recorder into his bag. When the article goes live tonight, the whole country will know. Renee looked at Ethan carefully. You ready for that? Ethan thought about Victor, about the board, about the legal battles that would certainly follow. Then he looked at Annie again. Yes, he said quietly. I am. Brooks began walking back toward his car. But before he left, he stopped and turned back. One last thing. Ethan waited. Brooks smiled slightly. Stories like this usually end badly for powerful people. Ethan shrugged. Maybe this one won't. Brooks laughed. I hope you're right. He drove away a moment later, leaving the hot dog cart standing quietly on the corner. Annie looked up at Ethan. Did we fix it? Ethan crouched beside her. Not yet, but we started. She nodded seriously. My dad would like that. Ethan believed she was right, because for the first time in decades, Samuel Whitmore's story had finally been told, and the world was about to hear it. The article went live at 6:12 p.m. By the time the winter sun disappeared behind the gray Detroit skyline, millions of people had already read the headline. The sun the Whitmore empire erased. Daniel Brooks had not written it like a scandal. He had written it like a story. A photograph led the article. A small red hot dog cart on Jefferson Avenue, steam rising into the cold air. Beside it stood a 6-year-old girl holding an old watch in both hands. Below it, The article began. 30 years ago, a man named Samuel Whitmore was born into a family that would one day build a billion-dollar financial empire. But Samuel never carried the Whitmore name. By nightfall, the story had spread across every major news network. Television anchors debated inheritance law. Social media argued about family loyalty. Legal analysts speculated about trust documents and estate claims. But inside the Carter apartment, the evening felt strangely quiet. Renee sat at the small kitchen table reading the article on her phone for the third time. Annie sat beside her drawing in a notebook with a blue crayon. Across the room, Lily watched cartoons softly on the television while Ethan stood near the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. Finally, Renee spoke. "It's everywhere." Ethan nodded. "I know. You realize what happens next. Lawyers. Lots of them." Ethan almost smiled. "I expected that." Renee set the phone down slowly. "And the rest of your family?" Ethan thought about Victor Whitmore, about the board of directors, about the flood of calls his office had already received. "They're not happy." That's an understatement. He turned from the window. "But they'll survive." Renee studied him carefully. "You're very calm for a man whose family empire just became a national headline." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Empires survive worse things than the truth." Annie suddenly looked up. "Are we famous now?" The adults exchanged glances. Lily answered first. "A little." Annie considered that. "My dad said being famous isn't important." "What did he say was important?" Ethan asked. She lifted the old watch. "Being remembered." The words settled into the room like quiet wisdom. Later that evening, Ethan's phone rang again. Victor Whitmore. Ethan stepped into the hallway to answer. "Yes." Victor's voice sounded tired. "It's done." "Yes." "The board is furious." "I expected that." Victor hid. "You understand what this means." "Explain it." "The trust will be challenged." Ethan leaned against the hallway wall. "By Annie." "Yes." Victor paused. "And the courts will likely recognize her claim." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said something that surprised Victor. "That's fine." Victor blinked on the other end of the line. "You're willing to divide the Whitmore estate with a child you met yesterday?" Ethan's voice was calm. "She's not a stranger." Victor didn't answer. Ethan continued. "She's my brother's daughter." The silence lasted a long moment. Finally, Victor spoke again. "You're choosing emotion over strategy." "No. I'm choosing family over fear." Victor exhaled slowly. "You're a very different man than your father." Ethan looked back through the apartment door where Annie and Lily were laughing together on the sofa. "I hope so." Victor's voice softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Samuel would have liked that." Ethan ended the call quietly. When he returned to the apartment, Annie ran over to him. "Look." She held up her drawing. It showed 2 watches side by side. Above them, she had written in large, uneven letters, "Brothers." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "That's beautiful." She pointed at one watch. "This one is my dad's." Then the other. "And this one is yours." Ethan knelt beside her. "They look almost the same." She nodded. "Because they came from the same place." Renee watched the moment quietly. Years of struggle had taught her to be careful with hope. But tonight something felt different. Something steady. Weeks passed. Spring arrived slowly in Detroit. The snow melted. The hot dog cart stayed open later each evening. And the legal process moved forward exactly as Victor had predicted. The courts reviewed the evidence. Samuel Whitmore was formally recognized as the son of William Whitmore, and Annie Carter became a legal heir to the Whitmore family trust. The ruling made headlines again, but the biggest change happened somewhere quieter. One afternoon in early April, Ethan stood in the Carter apartment doorway holding a small envelope. Renee raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Ethan handed it to Annie. She opened it carefully. Inside was a new school registration form. At the top it read, "Whitmore Academy Scholarship Program." Annie looked up. "What's this?" "It's a school," Ethan explained. "A good one." Her eyes widened. "Do I have to stop selling hot dogs?" Renee laughed softly. "Yes." Annie thought about that. "Okay." Lily grinned. "You're coming to my school." Annie looked at Ethan. "Are you sure this is okay?" Ethan crouched down beside her. "Your dad believed broken things deserve a second chance." She nodded. "He did." "Well," Ethan said gently, "families do too." That night, Annie placed both watches side by side on the small table near the window. Samuel's watch and Ethan's, 2 different lives, 2 different paths, finally connected by the one thing that had been missing all along. The truth. Outside, Detroit moved forward into spring, and for the first time in a long time, the Whitmore family name meant something more than power. It meant belonging. This story reminds us that truth and integrity are more valuable than wealth or reputation. Annie, a small child with very little, chose honesty when she returned something that did not belong to her. Her simple decision revealed a hidden injustice that powerful people had ignored for years. The lesson is clear. Doing the right thing, even when it is difficult, can change lives and bring long-buried truth into the light. Real legacy is not measured by money or power, but by courage, fairness, and the willingness to recognize and protect the people who belong to us. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.